On behalf of Civitas Academia, I congratulate Dr. Honoris Causa Robert Engle to receive the honorary doctorate degree from Universitas Airlangga today. Now, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Robert Engle III to deliver the honorary speech and all the public lecture with the title of The Prospect for Global Financial Stability. I also invite Professor Dr. Khalid Tanjung, Member of Board of Trustee, Universitas Airlangga, and CEO of City Corp, and Mr. Dr. Uwe Morawetz, Head of Commissioner of Financial Stability, as a panelist. This public lecture will be hosted by Ms. Desi Anwar. Ms. Desi Anwar, please head the event, and time is yours after this talk.
Hadirin yang kami hormati, kita beralih pada acara utama siang hari ini, yaitu kuliah umum bersama Profesor Dr. Honoris Causa Robert Engle III dengan tema The Prospect for Global Financial Stability.
Dear all of distinguished guests, we would like to move to the main agenda for today. Public lecture by Professor Dr. Honoris Causa Robert Engle III with theme The Prospect for Global Financial Stability.
Dan kemudian akan dilanjutkan dengan talkshow interaktif bersama para narasumber, yaitu Ketua Dewan Komisioner Otoritas Jasa Keuangan Republik Indonesia, Perwakilan Gubernur Bank Indonesia, dan CEO PT Transcorp Indonesia.
And followed by interactive talk show with the speakers, the Chairman of the Financial Service Authority Board, Republic of Indonesia, Governor of Bank Indonesia representative, and also the CEO of Transcorp Indonesia.
Acara ini akan dipandu oleh Ibu Desi Anwar. Dan sebelumnya, kami persilahkan Direktur International Peace Foundation, Mr. Uwe Morawetz, untuk memberikan sambutan.
As the moderator for today is Mrs. Desi Anwar. And before we start, we would like to welcome the Chairman of International Peace Foundation to give his speech. For Mr. Uwe Morawetz, please welcome.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, welcome to the 6th ASEAN event series, Bridges, Dialogues Towards the Culture of Peace. Bridges is facilitated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political and non-religious foundation under the patronage of 20 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. The events are hosted in cooperation with the country's main universities, and I would like to thank Airlangga University for hosting our event today. Having started in January 2017, Bridges will be continuously held in Indonesia until March, involving the participation of Nobel Laureates for physics, chemistry, medicine, and economics. The 6th ASEAN series of Bridges follows the series of 600 Bridges events which the International Peace Foundation has already hosted in many ASEAN countries since the year 2003 as an independent contribution for culture of peace and nonviolence initiated and promoted by the United Nations General Assembly. The pluralistic program of Bridges highlights the International Peace Foundation's intercultural and transdisciplinary approach towards peace. The Foundation does not take sides, but acts as a mediator by creating an independent platform for dialogue, where representatives of science, politics, economy, culture, religion, the media, and youth can meet, share their viewpoints, listen to each other, and find mutual ways of understanding and cooperation. Therefore, the Foundation itself is a bridge and a facilitator between different language groups in our divided societies, where politicians speak another language than artists, and business and religious leaders another one than scientists. In a highly interdependent world, problems cannot be solved by either one of these language groups only, but by working together. The ASEAN Bridges series comprises events with Nobel laureates from all fields. The Nobel laureates visit the region, not all at once, but separately, to conduct public lectures, seminars, workshops and dialogues hosted by local institutions during a continued period of several months. The topics of the ongoing events deal with the overall theme of building a culture of peace and non-violence in a globalized world, and with a wide range of issues in the fields of politics, economy, science, culture and the media. They especially highlight the challenges of both globalization and regionalism and its impact on development and international cooperation. The aim of Bridges is to facilitate and strengthen dialogue and communications between societies in Southeast Asia with their multiple cultures and faiths, as well as with people in other parts of the world, to promote understanding and trust. The events aim at building bridges with local universities in Southeast Asia to establish long-term relationships with Nobel laureates in all fields, which may result in common research programs and other forms of collaboration. By enhancing science, technology and education as a basis for peace and development, the events may lead to a better cooperation for the advancement of peace, freedom and security in the region, with the active involvement of the young generation, ASEAN's key to the future. This is why Bridges is not designed as a one-time event, but as a continued process of synergies to make the series of events a sustainable success for Indonesia and for Southeast Asia as a whole. I'm grateful to the Indonesian Honorary Chairman of Bridges, His Excellency Dr. Muhammad Yusuf Kalla, to Airlangga University, as well as to our other partners and sponsors who have enabled us to make the idea of Bridges a reality. I would like to thank everyone present today for taking part in this program. May it help us to facilitate a new culture of peace through dialogue, transcending its definition as merely the absence of war or armed conflict into a new understanding what the basis for peace is: education. In this sense, we welcome today the 2003 Nobel Laureate for Economics, Professor Robert Engle, who has kindly agreed to come to Indonesia with his wonderful wife, Marianne, to support the events. We now look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution to build bridges. Welcome, Professor Engle.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, students, and Airlangga University. It is a great pleasure to be here. Thank you. It is a great honor as well to be an honorary, have an honorary degree from Airlangga University, and I am appreciative of your joining us today. I would like to talk about the prospects for global financial stability. And what I've shown you on this first slide is a picture of stability. If you could back up just a moment. Thank you. This is a picture of a lake which is very still. There is no instability on this lake, just gentle clouds in the sky, blue sky overhead, and no turbulence in view. This may be the way the world looks today, but we don't think it's the way the world is going to look necessarily in the future. And our question is, what do we expect that can happen if we look out on this lake in the future? Is it going to stay calm like this, or will there be turbulence, and will we have notice of the turbulence as before it comes? And how do we assess that? So now we have the next slide. Can I ask you whether you can hear me all right? Yes? And how's my English? Oh, good. I'm not sure the people in the back are so happy, but we'll proceed. Possibly that would be better. Does that make any difference? Anyway, so here is a map of the world. This is a map from our website at VLab. And this is a picture taken, I guess, 2 days ago. When you go to this website, which you could do sitting in your chair here, you will see this map. It's green where the financial market volatility is low compared to what it was in the past. And it's red where it's high compared to the past. What you see is that almost everywhere in the world, financial market volatility is low. Maybe not in Venezuela, maybe not in Tanzania, maybe not in Morocco, but look at Southeast Asia, in Australia, New Zealand, and China, and India, and Russia. They're all completely green. This is the calm lake. Today is a period of low volatility, but what we're going to talk about today is whether we expect this to stay low volatility and what will be the warning signs that we look for in the future. Next slide, please. When we talk about risk in financial markets, we should remember that financial markets depend on risk. They are markets for risk. If there were no risk in financial markets, then stock prices, for example, would never change. If stock prices didn't change, everyone would hold the same stocks. There would be no incentive for firms to improve their products. There would be no incentives for firms to invest and take on new projects. Capital will not be allocated efficiently to the best companies if there's no risk in financial markets. We know that financial markets have risk, and that is a function of these markets. Let me show you in a picture. Here's a picture of a chimpanzee. He is in the top of a very tall tree, and he is trying to catch insects to feed himself. He is taking a lot of risk by reaching out for these insects. And the further he reaches, the more risk he takes, but the more insects he is likely to catch. We call this the risk-reward trade-off. The more risk he takes, the more reward he gets. This is the way we think financial markets are supposed to operate, and we learn fairly fast how much risk is appropriate for us to take. We don't want to fall out of the tree, and we take moderate risk and get moderate return typically. So, the next slide. I want to contrast that with systemic risk. We have just seen the financial crisis in the US. We saw financial crisis in Asia in the late 90s. These are examples of systemic risk. And the question is, what is the difference between systemic risk and ordinary risk? Let's look at the next picture. This looks the same as the other picture, doesn't it? But there is a new piece of information that I'm going to tell you. Suppose this chimpanzee is the last male chimpanzee in the world. Then how do we feel about the risk? If he falls out of the tree and kills himself, it's the end of the race of the chimpanzees. So if he is taking too much risk, we are not happy about it. And so government policy might try to reduce the amount of risk he takes, because his risk affects all of us. And this is what we mean by systemic risk. In fact, government policy has some choices here. We might hire government workers to stand under the tree with a tarp and catch him if he falls. Tarp is in fact the word we used in the US when we bailed out the banks. And so this is an example. But as you probably can see, he is going to take even more risk if there is a tarp underneath him. So maybe this is not the best solution. Another solution is to tie him closely to the tree so that he can't reach out so far, but then he will perhaps starve and not be able to feed himself. So with systemic risk, we have a situation that the risk is borne not just by the person who's taking the risk, but is shared with other people, and maybe with the country as a whole. Next slide. What we've discovered, and the financial crisis made it clear, is that the risk of a financial institution might have serious consequences for the real economy. That is, if a major bank fails, it might make the entire economic system collapse or be vulnerable. And it's certainly true that the more risk there is in the financial system, if there are more companies at risk, then the whole financial sector is likely to be systemically more important. So the regulatory challenge that we face in all over the world is to ensure that financial institutions have sufficient capital so that they can not only withstand the financial crisis, but continue to intermediate and provide financial services to the real economy. That is, good regulation is prevention, not rescue. Next. Of course, we have to be concerned whether we are preventing the last financial crisis or the next one. That's what this picture is supposed to make you think. So, how do we talk about whether banks are taking too much risk? Well, banks are like, next slide, banks are like people. They're like families. Families have savings. And the reason they have savings is so that if you lose a job or you have a big sudden expense, you have enough savings so that you can cover these. Banks are similar. They take in our money, which we deposit with them. They invest it by making loans to businesses, and other enterprises. And if these loans go bad, then the banks will lose the money on the loans, and it might be enough that they lose on the loans that they will be unable to pay back the depositors like ourselves. In which case, we say the bank is insolvent and is likely to fail. So the question of how much risk a bank is taking is not a question of whether its day-to-day risk is going up or down. It's a question of whether it has enough financial capital so that it can survive a big negative event such as the financial crisis. So I'm going to show you some numbers which estimate where these systemic risks really are. And you should think about the bank like the second chimpanzee. If it fails, it imposes costs on all of us. And so therefore, it's important that we regulate it so that these banks don't fail. So to measure how close they are to failing and what it would cost if they do fail, we calculate a number we call S-risk, which is the systemic risk of a bank, and it's measured as the capital that a firm would have to raise in order to survive and continue to function in a financial crisis. So for each bank and on each day, we're going to calculate a risk, the number of dollars that this bank would need to raise if there's another financial crisis. So here is my one slide with equations on it. Now some of you are at the university. How many of you are at the university? Students? Faculty? I don't see any students here. Are there any students here, or are you just too shy? Okay. Oh, there we go. Good. Any more? Okay. So students see equations probably all the time, and my students do too. But I only put in one just so you would feel at home. This is an equation which describes the S-risk. Basically, it says how much is the capital shortfall of the bank if we have an event which occurs which we don't expect, that is a financial crisis. And the answer is, well, we think that in the financial crisis, the capital should be some proportion of the total assets of the bank. That proportion we use as a little k, and the difference between k times the assets and the actual equity that the bank has is what we call the capital shortfall, and we want to estimate what that will be. The main thing that happens in a financial crisis in our model is that the banks all come under heavy stress, and the stress shows up because the global economy slows down. The stock market around the world, we suppose, will decline in another financial crisis like it did in the last one. It declined about 40% over a 6-month period in 2008. And we think that that is a way of describing the stress that a bank would feel. So when the stock market goes down, globally, the stock valuation of most banks will go down also. It'll go down some. It might go down a lower proportion than the global market. It might go down a bigger proportion of the global market. That coefficient is what finance professors call beta. They want to know, what is the beta of this firm? So if the stock market goes down by 40% and the beta is 1, we would say that the stock on this firm would go down by 40%. Okay? So the most important part of this is calculating beta. And here is where we use econometrics, because we have to know what the beta is at each point in time, but it's changing over time. Sometimes the beta is bigger and sometimes it's lower. It depends on the economic situation and what our firm's portfolio is. So if we see the next slide, what we do is we calculate the beta, as I say, using modern econometrics, which is closely related to what I got the Nobel Prize for. It's the Arch or Garch model, but we also allow correlations to change as well. When we manage to do this, we can calculate S-risk using this formula that I just derived, and you probably can see that this S-risk depends upon how big the bank is. It depends on the size of the debt and the size of the equity. So if the bank is twice as big, the S-risk will be twice as big. If the beta is big, you can't exactly see how the beta enters. It's riskier, and so the bank would need more capital for a high-risk bank than it would for a low-risk bank. And if it has more leverage, that is, if the debt-to-equity ratio is high, then the effect of a drop in asset valuations is much more extreme than if it's low leverage. So there are these three factors: leverage, risk, and size. Risk or interconnectedness and size that determine the risk of the financial institution. Next slide. So we are going to estimate this beta using a kind of a high-tech approach which allows volatilities and correlations to change. We call this dynamic conditional beta, and this means that the risk of a firm is changing over time, partly because the beta is changing, partly because the equity values are changing, and partly because the leverage is changing. So all these factors are changing. And I'm going to show you results on VLAB, which, again, as I said before, you could be looking at on your cell phone. But I want you to look up here rather than your cell phone, right? So that's okay. Okay. Next slide. Next slide. So the dynamic conditional beta is appeared in the Journal of Financial Econometrics, and it's a new approach to estimating risk in financial markets. And so this is an image of a canoe which is going into pioneering areas. Next slide, please. So what do we see when we estimate this beta? Have any of you heard of Bank of America? No? Well, it's a big US bank. It's one of the biggest. And if you look at the beta of Bank of America, you can see it's changed very dramatically over time. I don't know whether you can see the numbers on this, but this graph starts in 2007 and goes up until, I guess, the end of 2016. And there is a 1 on the right-hand side, which tells you sort of what's the average beta for all companies. It's about 1. And that's the case where the market price of Bank of America stock will go down sort of 1 for 1 with the global equity market. So what you see is, on average, for Bank of America, the beta is pretty close to 1. However, during the financial crisis, it went as high as 3, which means that any collapse in the global market would have 3 times the effect on Bank of America And so it is taking a lot more risk than if the beta was just 1. The reason this happened is because Bank of America was heavily invested in subprime lending, subprime securitizing, and this was the asset class which was most involved in the financial crisis, and so changes in the global stock market were very much reflected in changes in Bank of America stock. The next slide shows you Goldman Sachs, where Goldman Sachs is riskier on average than Bank of America. It has a higher beta, but it didn't go up particularly during the financial crisis because they were not in that business. So the beta tells you a lot about what's happening. You can see it went up a little bit in 2011, which is when the European sovereign debt crisis occurred. And but it's mostly just sort of wiggling around. Next slide. How about Mitsubishi? So, you know Mitsubishi? I think Mitsubishi is here, right? So, what you see from Mitsubishi is that its beta, on average, is around 1. It went up briefly during the financial crisis in 2008, but stayed pretty low until recently, and it's gone up fairly substantially in the last year, maybe. So, I don't know, or maybe 2 years actually. I don't know whether this is Abe economics or whether this is the global slowdown that we're seeing, but we certainly see a rise in the beta of Mitsubishi. Next slide, please. Here's BNP Paribas, the giant French bank, the largest French bank, and you can see it didn't have a beta increase during the financial crisis, but it certainly increased during the European crisis in 2011 and 12. And now, if you look at the end of the sample, you see a jump up in 2016, which is Brexit. When Brexit happened, the risk of BNP Paribas went up. But it came back down again, and now right at the end, it seems to be rising again. Next slide. Deutsche Bank has been in trouble for a while. The US Justice Department has accused them of bad behavior during the financial crisis, and that pushed up their beta, and then Brexit happened to keep it high at the end of the sample period. Next slide. Barclays showed a high beta during the US financial crisis, a high beta during the European financial crisis, and a very high beta after Brexit. Beta might have gone as high as 3.5 for Barclays Bank. Do you have Barclays here? No. Next slide. How about China Construction Bank? Do you know the Chinese banks? Well, this doesn't show much effect from any of these events that we've been talking about. In fact, the beta is approximately 1, which means it's relatively low risk. Next, please. Agricultural Bank is also low, but in fact is considerably less than 1 over this sample period. Next. So the Chinese banks seem to have a rather different behavior from what the US and European banks and Japanese banks showed, which is that the risk seems relatively low for the Chinese banks. So we'll come back to that shortly. So now that we have calculated all these betas, we need to combine those with the financial data on liabilities for these firms, and we will be able to calculate what the S risk is. And here is a picture of how scared I am of what we're going to find when we look at the S-risk around the world. So the first question is, if we add up the S-risk for all the financial institutions in the world, what kind of number do we get? What would it cost to bail out all the financial institutions in the world? Next slide. Here's the answer. It's a number which currently is about $3 trillion. It's a pretty big number, but it's not an astronomical number. During the European financial crisis and the US financial crisis, it was around $4 trillion. If you like to think about it this way, $3 trillion is approximately what the Chinese foreign exchange reserves are. So this means that China, if they were so inclined, could bail out all the financial institutions in the world if we have another financial crisis. So it's a big number, but not outrageous. Next slide. Where is this risk? Well, here are the countries. So if you remember, we do this for each financial institution, and then we add up the numbers. We add them up within each country, and then we add up the countries. So the top country on this list is China. China, it looks like the total S-risk would be something like just under $700 billion. Japan is next, then France, UK, United States, Germany, Italy, Canada, Spain, Korea, India, Switzerland, Taiwan, Australia, Sweden, Netherlands, Brazil, Israel, Belgium, and Greece. No Indonesia. But this is just our top 20 countries. Indonesia's down further. It might make more sense to look at these numbers relative to GDP, because if this is the amount it would cost to bail out your banks, you'd like to know how much is that going to cost compared to our GDP. So the next slide has the answer to that. So it looks like now France is the top country, Japan is second, and the UK is third. The UK has increased its S-risk substantially as a fraction of GDP since its Brexit. Then Switzerland, Spain, Canada, Greece, Italy, Korea, Israel, China, and so forth. Next. Well, you might wonder, first of all, what's happened in the US? As you can see, the S-risk has fallen quite dramatically since the peak of the financial crisis, and today it's down about as low as it was before the financial crisis began. That's good news because the banks have more capital than they have in the last 10 years. More of a capital cushion. In fact, the news is slightly better than that because a good portion of this risk is actually insurance companies, not banks. And so the banking sector is actually a lot more healthy than it has been for quite a while. You can see the top bank is Citigroup, followed by Bank of America, and then we have MetLife and Prudential Insurance, then banks, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, 3 more banks, then 4 insurance companies, Lincoln National, Principal Financial, Genworth Financial, and Hartford Financial, and then and so forth, some more financial institutions. So do you know these names? Some of them, right? Okay. Next slide. But what do we see when we look at Europe? Well, in Europe, we see that the decline has not gotten back nearly as low as it was before the financial crisis, first crisis began. It's still at about, I don't know, $1.2 trillion or something like that, and had a big increase in 2016. I think this increase in 2016 is really one of the things we need to be talking about here, because this corresponds to the slowdown that I think Indonesia is feeling, but in fact the whole world is feeling. And Europe certainly is feeling that. Next slide. What about emerging markets? And this is emerging markets without including China. And what you see is that they did peak in 2008, but they have not gone to zero. They're getting higher and higher and higher. So the risk in emerging markets is increasing over time, while for at least for the US, it has been decreasing. Now I've not included China in here because China is so big. So let's take a look at China itself. China is even worse than the aggregate of the emerging markets. The increase in S-risk is very dramatic in China. And we often hear about this as the debt problem in China. Well, I think this is the debt problem, and a lot of the debt problem is sitting in the banks. The assets of the banks are debts, are liabilities, are loans to state-owned enterprises, many of which are not likely to be able to pay back their loans in full. And so the balance sheet of the Chinese state-owned banks is deteriorating all the time. But which are the most systemically important banks? Well, we've already looked at the beta of China Construction Bank, but number 2 is the Bank of China, then Agricultural Bank, then ICBC, then the Bank of Communications, China CITIC, Industrial Bank, and so forth. These Chinese banks are gigantic banks. They're very big. They have a substantial amount of leverage, but interestingly, they have low risk. They have low risk, and I showed you the betas. And so they're high not because their beta is high, they're high because they're so big and have a lot of leverage. Next slide. So I give talk like this often in China, and invariably I get asked the question, does this model apply to China? Because China has state-owned banks, it has mostly state-owned enterprises, and it has what we would call its own breed of capitalism and socialism, some combination of those points of view. But the fact that the banks are state-owned means that they are almost totally unlikely to fail. If a state-owned bank is about to fail, it will be recapitalized by the government. There is no chance that these banks will not be recapitalized, I think. But that's not the good news. That's actually bad news, because we believe that one of the reasons why the banks take so much risk in the US and Europe, and maybe in China too, is because they're too big to fail. And if they're state-owned, then they are too big to fail in perfectly clear way. They're not going to fail, and therefore the risk that they shoulder is really not the risk that they are going to fail from, it's risk that is going to be passed on to the rest of the economy. In addition, government guarantees distort risk-taking, regulatory incentives encourage lending that a well-managed private bank wouldn't do. All the lending to the state-owned enterprises. Shadow banking is a very important part of the Chinese economy, and it's unclear whether it has government guarantees or not. And so some people believe it does and invest a great deal of money in shadow banking products like wealth management products. Other people think maybe it doesn't. However, China has plenty of capacity, as we discussed at the beginning, to recapitalize the banks, and will do so when it's needed. So I don't think the risk in China is that we're going to have a collapse of the economy like we did in the US when Lehman went bankrupt. It's more likely that we're going to have stagnation, not collapse. That is, the banking sector is not doing a good job of allocating its capital. It's sitting on it. It's lending to state-owned enterprises that aren't very healthy. And then when they can't pay back their loans, it extends a new loan to the same state-owned enterprises, and as a consequence is starving the productive part of the Chinese economy. This is my view. But I think it's actually a common view in China too. Next slide. So what about ASEAN? We haven't talked about ASEAN yet. So here's a picture of ASEAN, and what you see is that its risk was pretty high during the 2009 financial crisis, went back down again, but has gone up quite dramatically recently. Summer of 2015 up to the present, it was substantially higher. So let's take a look at where this risk is. Well, it turns out that the largest contributor to this risk is Singapore, followed by Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines has almost none. And actually, the other members of the ASEAN community, we have no large banks, no large domestic banks, so they're not in our database. So really it's just a six-country version of ASEAN that we're going to look at here. So Singapore is the biggest, but Indonesia is tiny. So why is that? Well, let's take a look at the banks in Indonesia. So here is a kind of a detailed picture that I'm sure you can't see because, well, I'm trying to look at it on the back screen there and I can't really read that. So if you're trying to look at it on the front screen, it's probably the same. But for those of you who can see it, the third column of data is the S-risk number. And if you look down that column, you'll see there are only 3 positive values and all the rest are negative. So that means that 3 banks, we think, would need to raise capital in a financial crisis, whereas 17 banks would have excess capital even in the middle of a financial crisis. Some of them would have a lot of excess capital in the middle of a financial crisis. So if you look at these banks, the largest bank by assets in Indonesia is third from the bottom, Bank Mandiri. And it has a negative 6 billion S-risk. The next is Bank Rakyat, which has 7 billion surplus. I think the third might be the last one, Bank Central Asia, which is 15 billion surplus. So the largest banks in Indonesia are the least risky. This is why Indonesia does not look like it has financial risk. But I should say that that's not entirely good news, Because if banks have no risk, what it means is that they have lots of deposits and not many loans. That they have not been effective in taking the risk of investing in companies. That too much risk is a bad thing, but too little risk is also a bad thing. These mostly are state-owned banks, and therefore they really could be much more effective in making loans to the economy of Indonesia. And it's one of my suggestions that I made this morning, is to try to get the incentives adjusted so that the Indonesian banks will feel empowered to make loans to the growing companies in this economy. And if they're not able to do that, then perhaps what Indonesia should do would be allow some new banking startups, or some new shadow banks, or some new online banking systems that can actually take deposits, maybe pay a higher rate of interest on those deposits, and channel that into the sectors of the economy that are growing. Okay, next slide. So I showed you the map of the world from the volatility point of view. Let's take a look at some more dates on that map. Next. So this is the beginning of the summer. It looks kind of like the one I already showed you. June 8th. So now let's look at the end of June. Next slide. June 28th. What you see is suddenly the map has turned almost all red. The US is red, Canada is orange, Europe is all red. There must be 20 markets in Europe that are all red there. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa are all red. So what's happened? Well, we had Brexit. The Brexit vote was a couple days before this, and volatility in almost all markets around the world went up. The only ones that didn't respond were pretty much China, Russia, maybe India, and actually Indonesia didn't really respond very much to the Brexit vote. But many of the financial markets showed higher volatility. The next slide shows that it didn't last very long. By July 10th, some of these red countries had turned orange. South America was half green again. And the next slide shows that by August 30th, we're back to green again. So Brexit was a temporary period of high volatility. I don't think that means we're not going to see more volatility from the actual Brexit, which hasn't even happened yet, but it means that the volatility did die out. Next slide. So November 8th was the day we had our election in the US. So this is the volatility prediction on that day. It was made on the 7th. And as you can see, pretty much we're all green, although there are a few countries that are red. But if you look at the next slide, you'll see that there is a whole lot of red around the world after it was announced that Donald Trump was going to be the next US president. You can see in particular Mexico is bright red. His threat to build a wall and to cancel NAFTA was very bad for the Mexican market. You can see Latin America is mostly red, Australia is red, and Indonesia is red. Philippines are red, Japan is red, Myanmar is red, Thailand is orange. So if you think about it, these are the countries that had signed on to the TPP agreement, and that it was pretty clear that Trump was going to cancel that. And all those trade partners had financial markets turn red. Next. So what is the future? It's now back to green, as you know. What is the future of globalization? Next. Well, that's hard to know because predicting the future is pretty tough. Next. I think we're going to see a lot of things that might happen in the U.S. and I get asked about this every place I go, so let's just talk about it for a minute. That is, I think Trump will move to reduce immigration. He certainly has moved to limit Islamic immigration into the U.S. from his 7 most favored countries. But it's widely believed that he is going to propose other immigration policies which will make immigration from other places more difficult as well. The U.S. is likely to negotiate and then renegotiate trade policies. The U.S. is threatening to raise tariffs on imports, but within